Good afternoon. Welcome to this lecture. My name is Tabitha Mtombeni. I'm a final year PhD student. Happy to say that. And I work at the Council on Higher Education. I have the honorable pleasure of introducing our speakers this afternoon. We have Prof. Nico Klute and Prof. Ian Bunting. They're going to give us, going to share with us some information on institutional differentiation, and I'm not too sure of how they're going to do this, but they know how they're going to do it between the two of them. So over to you.
In light of our discussion of this morning about the PhD and the demand for PhD, I had an interesting interaction over lunchtime. Firstly, my wife phoned me and she said that she was listening to a radio station in Cape Town who was, where they were having a program on the PhD. And my Khan, our strange friend, was holding forth while we were not there. But then the master's students phoned in and said, but we've got a master's degree and we can't get a job. So Mike said, don't worry, you get the PhD and you'll get a job. So for you, it was 1 year away. But then the similar thing coming on the way here, I quickly said goodbye to Salim. And the first thing that Salim talks about as a funder at Mellon is to fund PhDs to start responding to this big controversy that's going on now about the lack of black professors. You know, there's a big thing between Max Price and Kulela Manku, and it's all over the newspapers. The UCT has got one black woman professor. Rhodes is not a lot better, although Rhodes has got a much more famous one. The thing is, so you are really on the right edge here. And if you want to get a PhD and you don't get a job, phone Mike Khan, who works for the DST. I just want to talk about, we're going to talk about differentiation, which is a very big topic in Africa and in South Africa. In South Africa, one of the things we didn't want to address in the National Commission on Higher Education was differentiation. So it got passed on. And that has been very useful because for 18 years since then, I have got funding from all over different places in the world dealing with the issue of differentiation that we don't want to deal with. So it's kept me going. And finally, the white paper says differentiation, but Ian will tell you that it doesn't mean anything. But we will get there. But what is the context of this differentiation debate? The context is firstly the issue that we discussed just before lunch, the issue of massification and an elite system. Why are systems massifying, wanting large percentages of students participating in higher education? And this was the slide that I didn't show you last night. If you look at this World Economic Forum stages of development, and you look at enrollment rate in tertiary, it's not higher education, tertiary, meaning post-matric. And you look at quality of education ranking, and you look at overall competitive ranking. This isn't a causal relationship, but it's an associative relationship. They go together. Look at the factor 4% participation rate. It's now up to about 9, 10, 12 for Uganda. Quality of education, and then look at where they are competitive. But the moment you start going over 20%, remember South Africa is now at 20%, you can see a change in South Africa. But South Africa is the one outlier where we have a fairly good enrollment, but our quality ranking in schooling is worse than Mozambique or something. So I mean, but not in competitiveness. And then, as I told you, the countries at the top end, 94, 98% participation, and they're also some of the top countries in the world in terms of competitiveness. So there's this pressure that if you want to move into a next development level, you certainly have to get your participation rate up. And now I just want to show you the system that's supposed to be the most clearly differentiated, and which is very successful, has been very successful in terms of innovation and economic development is, of course, the US system. And this is how it pans out. Associate, professor, bachelors, community colleges, etc. The bottom group, about 2,000 bachelors and masters, 1,000 doctoral, 850, and then the elite research universities, about 50. So it's a clear sort of pyramid. You cannot have a massified system with all the universities trying to be elite doctoral universities or research universities. You have to have a system where there's a spread out, but where people who leave school actually do go into some post-secondary, post-school education. Now I want to show you how can I get to it? It's not busy. Can you get this? I think that's want to go to the previous slide, yeah. See. Ah, that one. That's it. Thanks. You see, these women are going to take over not only the PhDs, previously at the conference I would say, is there a white man from a Technicon who can come and do this? But not anymore. This is how our system looked, and still looks, a bit of a difference. Well, that's just the ours is an inverted pyramid. And the first day in the National Commission in 1995, J.R. already said the problem with the South African system is an inverted pyramid, and in 2012 it's still a problem. But where the real problem is here. That's the so-called needs, a term that we discovered, and then we discovered the Brits had used for many years, but we didn't have stats in South Africa. And that's now, the figures now in 2012 is 2.9 million. Kids between 14 and 18 who are out of school, who are not in education, who are not in training, so not education and not employed. And then the college sector. Now, Blade's announcement yesterday to this money, he is now proposing that the college sector will grow to about 1.5 million over the next 10 years. And the university sector is supposed to grow to also about 1.5. So that hopefully in about 2020 or somewhere around there, we will have a system where at least the number of people in the university system and in the college sector will be similar. But this is still our big problem. What kind of education? And the problem here is that there's a mixture here. There were 750,000 kids in here with a matric pass. In other words, they had completed school and they were ready to do something. And after all the investment of their family and of the state and of everything, they had nowhere to go. And then there was 2 million, who hadn't finished school and who had nowhere to go. So that is when people talk about what is the challenge, etc. And that's what we can only address if we massify the system. The system has to expand. But it's not an expansion of this university, sending everybody to the university. That's not going to work. So now Ian is going to tell you about the differentiation debate that lurks around that issue.
Has lurked for years.
Lurked forever. For those of you who don't know Ian, he was the master of residences here at Rhodes for many years. He's a failed theology student, like I'm a failed psychologist. Both ended up in higher education policy. If you fail in a profession, go into higher education policy. And for 20 years was the dean at UCT, and then for 10 years was head of higher education in the national government. Head of planning. Okay.
Having had that introduction from Nico, I'm afraid my stuff is going to be perhaps a lot flatter and more detailed. I've got too many slides, but I'm sure I can move through them more quickly than in some parts. What I hadn't frankly realized that we have quite a large number of non-South Africans present, because I'm talking about South African debates about differentiation. So that part I will try to glide over quite quickly and then get down to the more nitty-gritty detail of where we are. That way. So what I'm going to do is, that looks a lot. You can see already why I've got so many slides. Because in section A, I wanted to look at the differentiation debates, which South Africa hasn't dealt with them adequately for all kinds of reasons that we will look at. So there are four key documents that I've looked at there. And then in B, the latest versions that we have of the green paper, and there's which is the policy proposals on post-school education, and then the actual white paper, which came out in about December last year, which is supposed to be the final policy word on these things. Then I want to talk in section C about what we've been doing at Chet. How are we trying to, with Chet, go down to the key notion is going to come out is this notion of evidence-based policy, the need to get empirical data and to make your judgments based on that. And this is not, as we had the argument went on last night after the meeting, it's not about managerialism. We're not advocating managerialism. We are advocating evidence-based policy. So let me go through those. The white paper that we've talked about was a crucial document in our post-apartheid policy development. We had the National Commission on Higher Education, which Nico spoke about, 1995. It was finished. Then the white paper, there was a green paper then in the white paper. And I think just it may look a bit weird to many of you, those kind of what I call those axioms. But what was clear from the outset is that the white paper said we are not going to have a uniform higher education system. And the paper, partly it said at that stage, we can't afford it. The country in 1997 could not afford to have a uniform system. And the white paper then went on to talk about what I've called those axioms. And they look very odd, those ones, when you look back at them historically. You say, what on earth do they mean when they said academic programs are the basic elements of higher education and not institutions? I think the history of that was to say it was trying to indicate, signaling very clearly that all the apartheid created institutions had no right to continue to exist. They could not say, well, we are institutions, we have a history, we have a right to exist. So that came out by making those 2 points, that institutions are secondary. So the whole idea was that the system is supposed to deliver a whole set of academic programs, doctorals, masters, whatever. And then institutions then, as it were, those are bundled together into institutions. And the right of the institution to exist depends very much on what it is delivering in terms of academic programs. So you had that kind of background, a key one. And then probably far back in most of your memories is a very controversial report came out in the year 2000. The Council on Higher Education, probably too young to have been there at that time.
Celine doesn't remember.
The Council on Higher Education was asked to try to carry forward this idea of a program-based system. And it came up with these notions, and it unfortunately used what became a very emotive and explosive oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. Now I'm going, yeah. It used this very explosive notion of a bedrock. It thought that bedrock sounded great, the hardcore foundations of what the higher education system would be. But anyone that thought they were going to be a bedrock, it became an explosive term. Very very opposed to that whole notion of being a bedrock. And then they went to the extensive research universities, and then in the in-betweens were limited research. But what they were getting away from is they in a sense, tackled head-on that whole idea, which became a difficult, crazy notion that institutions are simply packages of programs. They went into it and said, what we will now do is we'll take the bedrocks, and they can do, you can see their undergrads up to masters, no research masters or doctorates, so only coursework masters. And then you see the limitations there. So that was the notion now to come up and say, let's differentiate on that basis. We will classify some as bedrock, some as limited, and some as the research. But the problem was that, of course, it reinforced the apartheid system. Because what happened, in effect, is that when you looked, there was no empirical, the data system was very bad at that time. So they had no real concrete data. There was no firm policies other than the white paper in place. But so what would have happened if they'd been implemented? You'd find that the bedrocks, so-called bedrocks, would have been all the technicons. And at that stage, there were 15 technicons, a total of 36 universities at that stage and higher universities and technicons in the year 2000. And then you would then have had the limited research, would have been all the historically black universities, would have been in that category of limited research, and then the extensive would have been the historically white universities. And that became the explosive thing, and I think why the government at that time again said, no, institutions are not basic, it is programs, was a way of signaling, don't believe that those 36 are going to continue as they are. So then we had, in 2001, there was a national plan on higher education. And one of Nico's friends and colleagues said it's the biggest, thickest national plan he's ever seen. I was part of the Department of Education group that was trying to do that. And we did bring a thick document, and it was probably far too big and too thick and too detailed. But the crucial thing in the national plan is that it again said, we are not going to take the apartheid higher education as a given. It's not a given. And because they said that following this idea of bedrocks, etc., you will reinforce the apartheid landscape. They said, we're not prepared to accept that. And so they went back to that notion that the academic programs are the basic elements. And so that's why I think in the end, and it's a notion which they never, all the time I was in the department, and I stayed on for about 8 or 9 years after the national plan, we never actually made any sense of that notion. I mean, we couldn't really get a grip on what did it actually mean to say that that individual universities are nothing more than the sum of ministerially approved programs. Because that idea of them being something but programs would mean you could move them off and move them out and stick them in different ways. So, but looking at back in retrospect, I really think it was a move to try and shake up the institutions in not believing that they were sacrosanct and that they could continue. And then we had the best we could do is to say it actually, if you had to try to explain what was this so-called program-based system look like, that's what it would be. The whole system, higher education system, would have been the sum total of all the programs, academic qualifications, major fields of study that had been approved by the minister for funding. And the key thing was approved for funding. And they were divided into these two categories, technicon and university type. And those two categories still remained fundamentally in our system. We still are stuck with the notion. And when you ask for clarification, what is a technicon type program? It becomes a circular definition. Technicon programs are those that are offered by technicons. And we no longer have technicons. And universities are those that typically, but I think they try to explain it by talking about technicon are more the vocational programs, the more vocational leading to career orientated. Universities are more the basic general education that you get out of a Bachelor of Arts or professional, like doctors, engineers, and so on. So that would be. And then what would then happen?
Just in terms of curriculum, I mean, those are really, and I told you from the beginning, nonsense terms. Who really prepares people for careers? The university, not the University of Technology. So, and So career education is a thing that the universities do as well with the professions as the technical. So it doesn't give you conceptually actually a distinction. So it never really helped.
No, it was. But all they then, the process then was, and this is really where for quite a few years of my time in the department, we were busy on that part there. How do we allocate programs on the basis of enrollment and performance? Because most institutions would feel that a lot of institutions were called technicons, but they felt that they couldn't be higher education unless they offered doctorates. And the constant battle we had was proposals coming forward for institutions to offer doctoral programs in a whole range of fields. And so we were trying, again on a very inadequate database, to try to do this. How do we analyze that? But ultimately the idea then came, you'd have a set of individual technicons, and in a sense I used to think of it as a package. Here's a package slice of technical programs. You take a big chunk of those programs. Then these so-called comprehensives, which are those who now are defined as institutions which offer both technicon and university-type programs, they take a slice of those things, and then the universities. So that's what we, for a long time, drove the enrollment and the planning processes in the universities, in the national department, trying to make sense of that. But the crucial thing that we did hang on to, and that was a crucial point that brought some sanity to the process, and that said, institutional visions and their visions and self-determined admissions do not play any role in the approval of programs, and so have no effect on differentiation. For a long time, that's been a fundamental argument running through South African higher education. Is they say, I've mentioned that case for a university which had a very ambitious, Technikon at that stage, a very ambitious professor in information systems who said, I can't face my colleagues elsewhere in the country or the world if I don't have a doctoral program. And we said, but look, the criteria we lay down, you don't satisfy them. But it's my vision, my dream. And some of them used to say, I want to be the MIT of Africa with the kind of ambitions. So that was the point where, in a way, the importance of evidence, data, performance started coming in there. But that got partly lost. Now, when the plan was implemented, I think the idea of the mergers became much easier. I suppose in a political sense, the program-based notion made it easier for the department to do all that merging, to go down from 36 universities to 23. Because then once you'd said programs are fundamental, as I said before, nobody has the right to exist or to continue existing. So that's why we now have, and this mergers, the minister at the time sold the mergers to the principals of the technicons, as they were called, by saying to them, I will call you universities of technology. And they were happy. They sat there and said, oh, that's great. So they took that. And those are really the old technicons but merged. I mean, there were about 11 or 12 technicons, which merged those 6. Those 11 universities, only mergers really were Limpopo, Northwest, were ones affected by mergers, but and then the comprehensives. And what you'll see when we look at our data is that this is a very strange collection, because they are it's not a coherent grouping of institutions other than that definition. In fact, some of them don't offer much by way of technicon programs at all. So that's the system now in terms of the mergers. Now, the HESA, the Higher Education South Africa, which is the body which looks after the interests of the 23, they tried for a long time to get back to shake away this idea of programs or primary. And what they tried to do is to say, But we have to take now that we've got 23, let's take them as now the basic units that we can develop. But they also accepted, almost surprisingly, they accepted surprisingly that, no, sorry, I've gone too far. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, they were quite happy in that strategic plan for government to decide institution X, yes, you're a University of Technology, yes, you're a traditional university, you're a comprehensive. So they were, in a sense, almost happy to say, you drop us into the boxes. What are those 3 boxes? But then they wanted this notion of self-differentiation. That came out very strongly right throughout. It's been one of the very difficult debates in South Africa, as I said earlier, to self-differentiate. We want to be able to choose what we want to do. We want to dream our dreams. And so they wanted then to say, once the 23 have been dropped into the boxes, within the boxes they should now allow self-differentiation. And that you could, for example, one of the examples they use is this one where someone in the university box can decide to make itself a research university, or it can say, which very few would, that I want to be a teaching university, or some have said, recognize me as a rural university. So those were and the difficulty has been that the Chet view around that time, that's the kind of things we were doing, we felt that all these accounts were inadequate. That there was no way in which the work that Chet was doing could build on any of those. And there you can see the kinds of points we were trying to make. I mean, the CHE had really its categories were really fixed, inflexible. And then they wanted within those very fixed to have self-differentiation. No empirical, at that stage they couldn't do it, but there was no empirical justification. The national plan and the program issue I've mentioned. And we felt that HESA placed too much emphasis on self-differentiation. And just as a quick example, what we did is we said, let's look at what do universities claim for themselves. And we went and looked at public websites where their visions and missions. And we looked at it in particular in relation to research. And so you can see there, what I put in red is the ones I think are totally unrealistic in terms of what we know now. And the oranges are maybes, and the greens are, yes, I think saying, yes, you are probably delivering where you are. But it's this thing that goes on in South Africa, this vision, dreams. We want to produce research outputs which meet international quality and productivity standards. And then if you look at those who build that in, you can see KwaZulu-Natal, maybe it should be an orange, but Pretoria also could be an orange. Probably Rhodes, Stellenbosch, and Wits amongst that group are the clear, yes, you are there. Johannesburg, probably very ambitious, or probably not a correct, it might have to be a red. It's not doing that. Western Cape, you see, and not one university said, we want Africa-wide recognition. That was not mentioned. 2 said a Southern African, which was, and I think there you can see, I think Western Cape probably is at that stage, which is a lower ambition than this international. And then there's the universities which simply said high quality, innovative. Certainly Cape Town's doing it. Fort Hare is on a track to be doing that. So is Free State, but then certainly the Reds are not. So, and that picture of the Technikons quite correctly said they shouldn't be in these boxes up here, but they put themselves there. But again, very little evidence of them doing that. So it's why we said we really should move away from visions and missions and try and get down to something slightly different. The green paper, I was probably only the one in the red circle that, sorry.
So can I just clarify, is that a snapshot from 2000 and how recent is that snapshot in terms of?
No, I think it's about 11 or 12, yes, somewhere around there. Yeah. So it is, I don't think any of them have changed. You're worrying about Rhodes?
I was thinking about Cape Town.
No,
There
They're very modest, Cape Town. My old university is quite modest. It just simply says, no, it says we want to produce high-quality, innovative research. Yeah. They're not saying we want international standard because they say we have it already. So why should we aspire to it? But Rhodes certainly has that in its mission statements, to produce those. And I think Rhodes probably is doing that. Very quickly, the green paper. It was when I read it, I was probably one of the few people around the Chet Circle who thought, this is encouraging. But I only read the part to do with universities. I didn't read the whole. The green paper is a massive document about post-school colleges and so on. But what it did do, I think it started helping settle a framework. It dropped the idea of programs. This idea that programs are basic was gone by 2012. I think most people would have realized it's just not even really a sensible definition. And they said that there will be, it said quite obviously, there will be three, they'll retain their current classifications. If you're a comprehensive now, you stay a comprehensive. But they did add that there will be flexible boundaries. So it would be possible for an institution to move from a comprehensive to university, if that was going to be. But self-determination was not accepted. Quite explicitly said, this is not going to be a matter of you coming with your dreams, etc., and telling us what you want to do. It spoke very explicitly it talked about missions, your mission, your role in the system, and your development path is going to be determined by the minister, who will in effect sign a contract with each institution. So the idea of a ministerial contract agreement was something that had been talked about even as far back as the National Commission, but it just began to be picked up there. And then, an institution could not say, if you're at University of Technology, I want to become a comprehensive, I want to offer Bachelor of Arts degrees, Bachelor of Social Science degrees, that's my vision for my institution. That would not allow a move across a category. That would only be possible if would be empirical performance assessments. And so number 6 then said, what does the system consist of? And so that's when it began to say the interesting things about the system will have a range of research intensive to largely undergraduate, and institutions will have various research focuses and various niches. The uniformity idea had gone, I think, which is in effect wrapping up what the white paper 97 had said. Now the white paper, the 2013 white paper came out in about December last year. I found it, looking at differentiation, I found it very disappointing. I think in some ways the white paper was a cop-out. It did not follow through. And perhaps the problem was the minister says in his introduction that he had over 200 submissions that come in about this. And I think a lot of them might have come from universities. But what it says, it follows through quite a few points, that the 3 categories will remain in place, the comprehensive university and University of Technology. But it says there will be no further categories. So you can't now get a 4th category or 5th category into the thing. It recognizes the notion of a continuum of institutions. It recognizes the point about the university sector having that range from undergrad to research. And then it says each institution will have a clearly defined mandate. But what it is saying now is that it's saying that the level of what you're doing now, the mix and level of your programs will not be fixed in advance, but can be developed over a period of time. It stresses that every university must offer undergrad. There can't be a research-only university. But then it does qualify it again by saying that there will be, every university will engage in some kind of research, but it would not be realistic to have similar research goals across. Again, it talks about differentiation being responsive to contextual realities, the institutions, the apartheid era notions which are still in place, and then a view about funding. Now, this is now why we're moving into the the kind of view move now towards the sort of things that Chet is trying to do now. Now, there were certain points that I looked for, particularly in the white paper, and I didn't see them. Is that, as I said there, I think it dodges key issues. And the key issues was the one about self-differentiation was a key issue, which it did not follow up. And it didn't come out indicate clearly enough the extent to which policy and evidence would come into it. So all it says is that the department, the DHET, will engage with universities and other stakeholders to develop sufficient national consensus on a program for differentiation and adoption of institutional missions. It doesn't talk about the contracts, the required with the contracts. It does not talk about self-differentiation. So in effect, what the department has done with the white paper, it's gone back, wouldn't quite say all the way back to 18 years, but a long way back, where you're still going to have this discussion about differentiation. I don't know how the department intends to engage with stakeholders on that. So I think our view is that by referring the differentiation back to the sector, it is a mistake, and that the department should have begun to look at implementation in a more decisive fashion by referring to performance of institutions and recognizing that institutions perform differently, and then having the signing of contracts. So what follows would now to start looking at some of the Chet stuff we're doing. Yeah. Now, what I thought I'd do, just very briefly, because of the length of what I have. Sorry? Yeah, push on. Nico tells me to push on. Is that, which I will do, I won't go through all the text. Sorry. What we had here is, this is a critical principle that I think operates in what the work that we're doing, is that a measure of performance must be relative to a set of goals that the universities expect to implement. And in a cross-national system, it was more difficult to get sets of goals across 8 different countries. And that, I think, is why I say it's not why the data and data analysis is not managerialism. It's about what are the goals and how do you relate the goals. Now, in the Harana project, just very quickly, what we tried to do is, down the left-hand side over here, is what we thought about were the key goals of a system like this. And we had justifications for the goals. We then talked about what percentage of your enrollment should be in science and technology, how many masters and doctors should you have, and so on. So we had the percentage of staff with doctoral degrees. So what we did was, we had our targets, we had our goals, which were derived from the institutional's views of what it should be doing. And then we had 8 universities, I just took 3. And what we did is we took averages across a number of years. So Botswana had 22% of its enrollments in science and technology. UCT had 41, Makerere had 24 at that period. And then what we did is we used a 3-point scale, strong, weak, medium, and that's how we assessed them. And we came up with an overall assessment down there that, in terms of those goals, Botswana was weak, UCT was strong, and there was kind of medium as far as Makerere is concerned. But we published that report in 2012, but only after we'd removed that table, because the participants did not want that table. They felt very strongly that they accepted that performance is relative to goals. They accepted the data, because the data were their data that sent to us, but they did not want their reviews to be based on value judgments by Chet. They didn't like the idea. They wanted rather to have an idea, which we published, was you'd say, if I go back to Botswana, what we would do is we'd say, that's the enrollments, that's the target. here are 3 other universities, what their percentages are, without making any judgment on Botswana, which is not a good way of, we didn't think it was a good way of doing it. What we're now moving ahead is, in terms of South Africa, given the context of where we are with differentiation, I'm going to offer a very quick outline of what Chet has been doing. And I'm going to look, first of all, at Chet's proposals on an academic core for South African universities and what the data would be. Now, I won't go through those one at a time, but what we're saying from the university system, given the context we're in Africa and the world globalization, that's what 4 key things that are needed. Strong enrollments in SET, strong doctoral enrollments, favorable ratios, experienced world staff, and there we have targets that we've looked at policy documents and elsewhere. We've got the targets, and there we have the other outside. So we've got only 8 goals. One of the things about performance assessment is that the data set we have now in South Africa is very rich, and you can probably draw 100 ratios if you wanted to. You know, there's lots of ratios in themselves are not important. And then we have these about success rates, high outputs of graduates. We have all our indicators there. And then what we would then do, we did the ratios, we did the analysis of the data, and we took 3 years of data from the higher education, the HEMA system, higher education management information system. And what we then did is calculated 3-year averages for the institutions. And I'll just put a few of them up there. You can see Rhodes sitting, the target is 40%, the average for 3 years of science and technology is 27%, and lowish there, and so on. So we had Rhodes being below in some areas and above in others. So those are the data. We then converted those to a 4-point scale by dividing the institutional score into the target. Oh, sorry, it was the other way around. The target into the institutional score. And we then get on a 4-point scale. So we rated it like that. And what am I doing going the wrong way? Okay. So what we then did is we did a conversion like that, and for some reason my computer suddenly dropped dots and started putting commas in. It's for decimal. Sorry?
It's more statistical.
Commas? You reckon? Well, I think we are both just statistically challenged in one way or another. But those would be in the scores. You can see with UCT, on theirs, 4s all the way, because and we didn't allow anyone to, if they went over the target, we scaled down to 4. And then you had Rhodes, you can see below there, below 4. And so that was what we did. And then we did a diagram. We did use radar graphs like this to show. Now this is work in progress. What this is now saying, if you took a University of Technology and you based it on, you assumed that the same goals and targets for a university applied, this is what Central University of Technology would look like. And you can see, if you look at those graphs, 4 is the target, and 3 would be, in a sense, would be more or less okay. But if you go down to a 2 or a 1, then the performance is below. And so if you looked at that graph, you'd see it's, as far as SET is concerned, it would be fine with the Technikon. But then postgraduate enrollment's way down, and that would be almost self-evident with the Technikon. Ratios, student-staff ratios are not great. Very low qualification as far as academics are concerned. And we've made percentage of senior academics an important criterion, because if your university has 1,000 academics and the only 200 of them are in the senior levels, then research and research leadership is going to be difficult. So when you looked at that if you looked at that very quickly, the fact that this graph goes like that, and then particularly on research outputs and so on, it's low. And but that's saying if I treated that technikon as though it were a university. And China University of Technology, much the same pattern, with the collapsing inwards. Johannesburg, one of our comprehensives, just the problem about the postgraduate is low on the university criteria. It's low qualified staff, it's got a number of senior academics, and then the outputs, research publications per academic are not bad, they're not on the target. That would be a picture of a comprehensive treated as though it was a university. Nelson Mandela, again treated as a university, has this whole row of, this whole line here would be we would say initially would be problematic lines, but short of target there. And then you go around, you can see better, and then on the output side, some of the difficulties there. Then you take Cape Town. And you see, because that now is a university, the only kind of, where Cape Town is showing on target everywhere, except there. And I think they're aware of that, although it's higher than 3, it's a fraction. But Cape Town does know that there's a problem about doctoral outputs. So that is an issue with UCT. Then if I take Rhodes as you see, hardly changes.
Also a university.
It's fully as a. But with Rhodes, the issues would be. I think I might have a problem. I must have missed that figure because it shouldn't be there. Those two anyway. But Rhodes, there again, some issues with doctoral, but not major issues with doctorates. So those then begin to give you a picture. That's Fort Hare as a university as well. You can see universities start, on these criteria, start differing. Already you can see different performance levels on the universities. And similarly, Limpopo, which is unfortunately, that's still the amalgamation of Medunsa and the old University of the North. That in terms of qualifying as a university, you've got those performance issues around there, particularly around research outputs, about academics, qualified academics, which medical schools don't always have staff with doctorates. And then some of the outputs here are not good. Those below 3 are indicative of outputs. Now, what we then had to do, and I'm now nearly finished, what we've said then is that the issue would be, it's a problem if you now, go for a uniformity, and you then say the same goals, targets must apply to all. And what we've tried to do now is to say, and I'll just show you, I've got separate ones with technikons, but University of Technology, but just for comprehensives. What we said now, the function of that institution, comprehensive, is not the same as university, because the comprehensive with their vocational, let's call it career training, places a lot more emphasis on business studies, accounting, finance. It doesn't have, it's not as, because of that large undergraduate numbers they have from the technikon side, they don't have to meet the same kind of criteria we would set for university, that you should have 15% of your enrollment in masters and doctorates, 3% in doctorates. We change the criteria and make it 40% in. That one is a difficult one because that says that's part of what the comprehensive is about. It should have a large proportion of enrollment in diplomas and certificates, the old technikon, and then 15% postgraduate in general terms, different student-staff ratios. We've also modified downwards this requirement. We've said for universities, 50% of staff, permanent staff, should have doctorates. And we said 60% should be professors, associate professors, or senior lecturers. We've given a modified one here. 30% with doctorates, 80% with masters or doctorates. And then, in effect, saying only 20% should be below masters. Some of our University of Technology, it's much higher, the ratio is much higher. And then there's the other indicators, changes. Success rate should remain the same. output rates should remain the same, but then modifying the research output requirements. Instead of saying one publication per academic, we say, let's say it's 0.5. So that's what we were doing, and there'd have to be a lot of argument and debate on that. But what I just would show very briefly then is, if you go back to what Johannesburg looked like as a university, it's not there. You looked at Johannesburg as a university, it looks, weaknesses, failures, etc. But that's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a comprehensive. So you go to the, if you go to the comprehensive picture, you get a picture of Johannesburg far more meeting targets. And that would say, at least as far as that's concerned, that institution is doing what it should be doing. The only real problems are the outputs of doctorates over here. You can see that's glaring. No, that's the research one. The research is on target there. So that's the only one. And perhaps borderline, a lot of junior staff still there. And so that looks as a technicon, it's on track. And then Nelson Mandela also, the shape changes as far as that's concerned. And what we want to say is that is now we would think that kind of analysis. At the same time, we would recognize there's a lot of argument, a lot of debate. A lot of people are going to go mad at us about our figures, challenging the criteria. Why do you use those criteria? But that would still, if you now take universities and you start ranking universities as universities, you can see then this is just that's just the average of averages. And there you can see the system starts dividing at about there. You can see those are the strong universities in terms of the outputs and what the kind of inputs they've got. So Stellenbosch, Rhodes, UCT, Stellenbosch, Rhodes, Wits are clearly the head of it. Port Elizabeth is not too bad.
Port Elizabeth.
Yeah, Pretoria. Yeah. And then Western Cape, interestingly enough, on those criteria coming up there. UKZ.
I think what's important there is that actually, despite all this regress and the historically black being disadvantaged, UWC has actually done the best. But Fordair is also now in the top group. So you can't just say you in the bottom group because you were black and disadvantaged. Even that is differentiating up into institutions performing differently in the system.
Yeah, but this is not this. Remember, this is saying the category of universities.
Yeah.
Now, within the category of universities, you may want to start drawing a line somewhere.
Yeah.
Free State's not performing as well as Northwest. Nico and I were, you can say, privileged to be part of a review group that looked at Northwest earlier this year. And their aspirations are way above what their actual performance, and that begins to show it. If I'd showed you their spider graph, you'd see where the substantial weaknesses come. Fort Hare is not bad, but then Limpopo is, if they'd stayed merged, when you start getting on that score, but again saying on our criteria, on our targets, you would begin to want to ask the questions about, does that warrant a shifting of category? Should it be looked at somehow differently? And then the technicons, the University of Technology. Sorry, I'm going too fast. The comprehensives. As comprehensives, those two are doing well. That's part of what we were trying to say is happening. But as comprehensive, these are not. And that's part of why the comprehensive category just simply doesn't work. And the problem with these ones here is that these were historically black universities which were told, you are now going to become comprehensives and you must now start adding technicon type programs. And on the criteria, they're not making it. UNISA is the way it is because that's the distance education. And Walter Sisulu is the UNITRA mixed up with the other two technicons. So you'd again begin to look at that and start wondering, what is I think that diagram for me shows the the comprehensive is not a very particularly coherent concept at the moment. And then just very lastly, the technicons, University of Technology. Again, you've got a picture of, as technicons, where again the criteria are changed, the expectations are changed in terms of that. You've got probably at least 4 well-functioning technicons, University of Technology. 1 not. And that one is a maybe. So that's the kind of pattern that we're doing, is after we, just to sum it up why I went this perhaps crazy route, is to say, in terms of the policies, we haven't yet got the policies that are needed, other than a laying down now of firm categories of the 3 categories. And talking about here's things can change or move or flexible without giving us any guidelines as to what it should be. And what Chet is now doing is taken up I think the very notion that came out of the Harana project, the notion of an academic core. What is the academic core of each university? And spelled out in terms of fairly tight goals and fairly tight targets. And then you have this, and then what would be, the case would be then to start saying, can we now begin to accept differentiation like this? No more categories are possible, but how would we build that institution up, and how would we build the others? Okay.
Thank you very much for that stimulating talk. We have some time for questions. We'll take a few questions at this point.
Yes, with the demise of that idea of a contract between government and...
They're not denied, it's on hold. I know where it is. It's not spelled
But
out.
it never made its way into one. So then we left, I presume, with the notion of the sector self-regulating through seen as being competition, I don't know how. Or the old method of the PQM as kind of being the method of... But I work with one particular University of Technology quite a lot, and it seems to me that they're involved in a huge idea that they're going to turn all their diplomas into professional degrees. And I keep sort of asking questions about, well, your students don't have matric exemptions, so how are they going to get into these courses? But I wonder, when these finally, because this is a lot of money being spent on it, when these finally make their way to the DHET, are they going to be stopped there? In which case, why is the institution spending so much time on this? You know, how's it going to happen in the absence?
I think the department hasn't. I think this idea of consensus is probably that the system has always been highly suspicious of the idea of a minister dictating. There's been this idea that the minister will say, you are a comprehensive, you are a technicon. So there's been attempts to, at one stage, he said, has tried to go in and try to break that link. But ultimately, I think the things that are still in place is this, the PQ, the high education qualification framework, which is now still in place. Probably take another 10 years to implement, but it's still there. But as far as I can see from the documentation, the white paper on universities is very short, very brief. And if you've looked at that, hardly not much in it at all. But my guess is when they say the categories remain, the definitions will stay the same. Technicon programs are defined as certificates, diplomas. So a University of Technology can't move away from offering of certificates and diplomas. And I think the scale, that I think would be, I'm sure that the department will take that as a given. Perhaps even the CHE would take that as a given, that they can't just go and convert to bachelor's degrees.
But Ian is saying the problem is, it's not clear that this is a political decision. The department is totally incapacitated. It's got a lower capacity than it had in 94 for all kinds of reasons. And probably the Deputy Director General hasn't been appointed over 4 years or 3 years. So it's more a fact that they actually, what they're telling me is they don't have the capacity to implement this now. So it's not that they postponed the idea, it's just that they're trying to write or develop a national plan which they don't have capacity to for, so they're not trying to put together a group to do that. But I don't think that's an abandoned idea. It's just whether they're going to get around to it, and the problem is how the system drifts. And yours is a very interesting example. You, and I'm saying this as a very long-time friend of mine, when you appoint academics who are trying to become a principal at a proper university, to become principal at the University of Technology or another university, then they try and make that institution like the one that they come from. So then they start thinking that they're universities. And in this country there's a huge, and in the whole of Africa, a big problem in the whole of Africa, and South Africa in particular, with the history of apartheid, is where manual work was supposed to be for Rhodes' invention. And some people must only do manual work. The issue is there is a very high knowledge economy requires high-level manual work and different levels of skills. And we've drifted into a situation where everybody only wants to do the top skills. And of course the PhD is now landing on top of this, isn't it, the top of the top. But that place that you're talking about, they should be doing proper diplomas. And so they should make sure that these students are getting good vocational diplomas, which is part of the skills chain that you need in a country. It also doesn't help that you've got a lot of PhDs and a lot of high-level skills people, and the person in the bank can't do a proper transfer. Or a person, when they build things, can't do the thing. But it's all over the world, but in South Africa it's even worse. Everybody's trying to drift up, because up is where status is, and the Mercedes, or small Mercedes. We really, that's what we've tried to resist, but we're not very successful. And the system is always ambiguous about it. The government is getting closer to now saying we do need clearer distinction and task, and these ones must do this. But everybody still wants to be up there.
Thank you. Yes, you have a question?
Okay, I just wanted to ask, in looking at the indicators for each of these, has the whole idea of internationalization been considered or discussed or part of the debates at any level?
We don't have an indicator. We don't talk about you until you've got an indicator.
But what I'm saying is, but like,
No, not yet.
but is that it's just because the internal issues of differentiation and transformation are so overwhelming that nobody's thinking about it, or is there a problem in identifying the indicator? Because actually, in practice, many of the universities are really pursuing quite a lot of internationalization.
But that's, so, you know, we talked about that last night, and I said the issue is you can't make sense of the kind of differentiation based the way we do. If you have a 50 list of indicators or data, you have to be selective, and that's why the notion of what is the core relative to, in our case, we've looked at when we did Harana, we looked at the 8 UCT plus 7 African countries. We were able to look at this and say, overwhelmingly, there is the emphasis on science and technology. It must have high-level outputs. Now, the notion of you see, this is what I said to you last time. I don't know how internationalization fits into that. It's not we've got 8 indicators that we've been using, and we've focused on the, not quite the input side. We got ourselves into trouble about talking about inputs. We're looking at the issues of the enrollments, the qualification of the staff, student-staff ratios, which are crucial, because in many countries they have far too many students. And when we looked at our African colleagues, business science has got grown enormously without the staff. So we're looking at that. We earlier looked at research funding. What's the research funding? Then the outputs are the graduates, research publications. So I think so others may want to come along with other sort of almost pet indicators and say, can you put this one in? Now,
But look, the indicators is part of the discussion. We are not starting, so we have meetings with the department and with people in the system talking about what do they think are key indicators at this moment. We also take it from time to time. Yes, yes.
Part of the problem with these numerical indicators is obviously that they tell us nothing about quality. So as universities try and push their spider web out to the outer reaches, there's enormous pressure on academics to get their PhDs and may hit our targets and become beautiful spider webs, but we don't know anything about whether or not anything's
Look, why interrupt us? Because over the years, we've constantly had this thing about qualitative indicators, and nobody's been able to give us what are these qualitative indicators. And ultimately, in the end of the day, in a philosophical sense, when you grade or evaluate, there must be something empirical on which you hang it. Now, on research publications, I mean, we are looking at accredited articles we now are separating between the South African accredited journals and those that appear on the Web of Science. You can fine-tune it down. Now, what more do you want in terms of saying quality of output? I don't think, when you look at the reality of what's happening in the university system, I mean, we've heard this about pass rates. When way back in 20 years ago, we were talking about pass rates as part of the subsidy. Everyone would pass and they'll push people through. Pass rates haven't changed. Output rates are changing to a certain extent, but it's not a reality. The reality is that to get the idea that somehow putting up quantitative indicators that you're going to get everyone amassing and pushing up towards them, it's totally, after 20 years of looking at this, it is just not a reality.
Well, I think it is a reality because, I mean, for example, I can show you the Ethiopian case, where Ethiopia employs me to go in and teach 100 doctoral students. So it is a reality that there's a push. So all of a sudden,
there's a push, but it's not
But the question is, are you saying that's wrong?
Yes.
If
Yes, I think
you
it's
help
absolutely
this pushing to produce more PhDs, is there something wrong with that?
Yes.
But
The
what?
model is deeply.
They should be.
If there's no supervisors and there's no facilities and no libraries, they want to produce PhDs at any cost because we're told that that's the output.
And why do they want to get PhDs so that they can have their own supervisors and they can stop hiring you?
That's not the whole of the story, actually.
No, it's a lot of the story. I've talked to them about that. That's exactly the issue. They want to produce their own PhDs and their own people. And do they now take, like South Africa is taking X years to produce black professors, instead of going to Africa and other places and hiring a lot of black professors, which we're now talking about. These are choices that governments have to make, and you've got to look at where you're going with it. I mean, in their case, if they wait for their system to produce PhDs, it's going to take 20 years. Meantime, the South Africans are doing moonlighting consultancies all over Africa and everywhere because they can't produce their own. What I do think, totally agree with you, is that the issue is what we haven't done enough, and we haven't had money for that, we're now trying to get some now, is you suddenly get these big increases in institutions, and how is that happening? For there is I and a whole lot of academics from other African countries on short-term contracts, 3 years. These guys are publishing furiously. What they're showing is you can publish at the historically black university. The story that we were told previously, conditions are so bad you can't publish. They and Northwest have blown that story. Bringing in African academics from other parts, they come there and they publish. The problem is, what are they publishing? They're publishing about stuff in West Africa in agriculture. It's only in agriculture and science. So they're not actually publishing about what's going on here, in the Eastern Cape, for instance. So I think there is when you put these targets, you put pressure, and then you get perverse behavior. And I do think what we need to do is study a lot more, and there's lots of PhDs to be gained by studying the responses of institutions. And some of their responses are good, and some of their responses are shortcuts, which is a big problem. But then you start balancing it and start countering it. Some departments, even the national department is also talking to say, well, Donaldson from Presley said to me the other day, we're going to cut this thing of just publishing more and more. Who are you publishing for? You can't go on increasing research output every year. And you're not telling us that ours is working with development. We've got to link, and they started talking about looking at how are we going to, the university going to show that they're actually contributing to development. Even the Dutch started that now. So that's going to change the criteria again, and people will perhaps do something different. But I do think the pressure does produce strange behavior, and it's something that we really need to study, and can be negative. And the other thing is you people. Hundreds of millions, no quality indicators. They do the self-study, they go and talk to the institution, oh, you must really improve, etc. The two things that they did that was fantastic was that the view of business schools and of education. And when you really close down some of them and say, look here, you're doing bad work. I think that's the direction the CHE has to go. But politically, we've not developed quality indicators because we don't want to face the racial, historical imbalance problem around quality, which I think is a big problem for us.
I've taken notes.
Like in the past, discipline.
I'm beginning to understand now why you failed academics go on to do this kind of work. I really do, because I think that this number is...
We were not failed academics.
Whatever you are.
Psychologists. That isn't the
Dentist, psychologist. Because what you're trying to do is basically rank institutions. And it's very clear that each institution has its own self-interest in being at the top. And the top is being determined by the number of PhDs you produce and the number of papers you publish. And there's a lot of money in this game. And you know that publishing is also a game. You publish in my journal, I publish in yours, and it goes on and on and on. And you talk about the knowledge economy, but our biggest problems are not to do with the knowledge economy. They have to do with the failure of schooling, the crisis in education, the ecological crisis, unemployment. 45% of our undergraduates are unemployed. So I wish that people who have the power to make policy and discuss these things will look at the real problems of this country rather than trying to produce PhDs, half of whom will not be employed, or getting PhDs from other countries who don't write about our issues and our problems. You seem to be aware of all the issues and all the problems, but I don't think this is the way of addressing it. Now, I was at the University of Limpopo, and I agree with you that it's, on the whole, a sea of mediocrity. But within it is a research center on materials modeling, led by Professor Ngwepe, who publishes internationally and produces 3 or 4 PhDs every year. Now, where is the internal differentiation? And shouldn't the job of people like you be to support those islands of excellence wherever they are, and to look at what institutions can do given their location and so on? If you tell an institution what kind of institution you want to be, they all want to be research institutions. So I think there's an innate problem with this kind of number crunch. I'm sorry to speak out like this, but this is what I think. I mean, for 20 years we've been having all these papers, white paper, green paper, 36 universities being made into 23, etc., etc. Are we anywhere nearer to a better understanding of what is happening? Are we?
No, but look, no, I don't think I'll answer because I've heard this for 20 years, and I think you think what we were doing is nonsense. And I think the kind of response that you give there is just a total lack of understanding of what is happening. What is going on is that the government wants to, they said the system is not to be uniform. We don't want a uniform system. We want to be able to identify those institutions which we regard as high-level research institutions, to which we can direct funding and money support. Now, at the moment, when we have no way of, universities tend to say, well, I'm a high-level researcher, and others say, no, well, I'm not so good. And I think it's just, we don't have quality indicators. If you can come and tell us a better way of saying, how do we move the system along? How do we get to a stage where funding, which is supposed to be, the planning and funding is supposed to be the key drivers of the system? I just don't see it. And there's nobody saying that if there's a centre of excellence at Limpopo, that mustn't be funded. I think the whole thing has been those centres of excellence should be funded, and that it will be funded. They are funded, and they are supported, but the university taken as a whole doesn't have that. And that's basically what we're saying. So when you look at Limpopo alongside the other universities, what the message should be is that there are obviously other levels and areas of support. A University of Cape Town might be because it looks good on our spider graphs. is a place where investment of high-level technology research would do. Limpopo is called a university. It's supposed to be doing these things, and they should be there. The funding should be there. Remedial funding should come in. And that, I think, is what government is trying to do. But it's not quite got there yet. So all we're saying is, look, in a sense, nobody's sitting back and saying, hooray, look at this, UCT's top, Rhodes is looking good. It's just saying that's the reality. And of looking at across the data, this is what's happening.
And what's a disappointment is backing off contracts. In contracts, we know these universities, these are average universities. As I said, UCT is only famous because of the medical school. If you really pack it down, the issue of a contract would be is that different faculties would do different things as part of the package that they would do with the government. But as long as the government is continuing to fund just on a few indicators of enrollment, etc., then it is going to be very difficult to differentiate. What we're trying to do is to say, okay, universities of technology doesn't have to produce so many international publications. They must produce more science and technology people, etc., etc. The government hasn't moved there yet even, but that's what we're hoping they can move towards. But the system hasn't addressed a lot of the big issues. That is true. But that's not. But you mustn't come with this thing that people, that the donor community have, university must solve all the problems. Some universities are even trying to help build houses in the village or something like that. You know, they're very bad with that. That's not the kind of thing they should be doing. And there should be other people doing it.
We'll tackle one more. I'm so sorry. No, she had a hand up before.
After we have heard about how the different institutional types are performing, and I want to link this to the previous presentation on the need for more doctoral outputs. Can we say we expect institutions like the UOTs to contribute to the 5,000, 6,000 outputs of doctoral graduates that we expect?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, the issue is that if you look at the statistics, they should simply not be allowed to have PhD programs. If the government wants to be hard-nosed and cut out apartheid and say we want to produce 5,000, then you look at the 5 top universities in producing them and you give them more money. Because they are the ones who are producing them. Remember that band I showed you? There's 5 universities where 60% pass rate is 60%. If you're not sitting government, you want to invest your money in PhDs. So you give it to some of these places like MUT Central has got 0 or 1% of the PhDs. But that's the complicated differentiation question, which often has to be answered politically. Do they? And can you have a university in which nobody in this university is allowed to do a PhD? I mean, that's what I showed you in the American system. And like in the California system, there's 3 bottom layers. The community colleges, the bachelors, the universities. They're not allowed to do PhDs. And they, if you're there, you want to go to another institution to do your PhD. But we've not had the political courage to say, okay, we draw a line there. And of course, academics then with PhDs may then leave those institutions because they feel they want to be a supervisor, they want to do research. And in that way, you may actually end up weakening that institution also. So it's a very complicated issue there. But it's a very important issue of where do you give your resources and where do you support the institutions to build these capacities.
Look at just about PhDs, the graph that Nico showed this morning, which showed that we're about 1,800 PhD graduates at the moment. I think the registration enrollment is about 14,000. At that ratio, at the upper ratio we have now, to get up to 5,000 or 6,000, we need to go up to 40,000 PhD students. And the issue would be, where are they to go, who would get this? I think nowhere has it ever been said that if there is a centre of excellence at any one of the categories, that will not be supported. And I think we find the NRF has been giving money to chairs, to the University of Technology, in very specialised areas which are then nurtured and funded. But the idea of going across the whole university system, I think is more
teacher at all.
As
The
a
type of
teacher in
work
the
that you
government,
do.
which is a big problem. It's part of this problem that these people who are not in education and training. What's happening in Africa? Mauritius got 3 million people. They've got 60 institutions. 60. Mauritius is the biggest Joburg, basically. 59 are pilots. The average size is 100 or 150 pupils. It's total chaos. They come from India, they come from England, institutions, and they recruit students there, give them bad education and a diploma or something. But they've got a very high participation rate, and it does lift the level of the people. It means people are getting some form of education versus nothing. The choice that we don't want to make is between low quality education and no education. And if you were to ask the people involved, I bet you they're going to take low quality education. Because some education is better than no education. And we all want to give high quality education. And that kind of private education is crazy. And it's really problematic. But that's a response to the government not providing enough education. And throughout Kenya, Mozambique has now also got like 35 institutions or something like that, but only one university. But they all call themselves university of some sort. So it was a big problem in South Africa that we missed the boat on private education to accommodate people who couldn't get into the universities. And again,